Oh, yes, I'm here. Hey, Jennifer.
Hi, Simona.
Hi, good to see you. Hi, Jackie. How was your class?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's been 2 classes since I last talked to you.
Oh my goodness. So it's a long day for you today.
Yeah. Tuesdays and Thursdays are bad. Thursday is better than Tuesdays because Tuesdays also tend to involve a faculty meeting, which is never pleasant.
Ouch. Okay, good to know. Oh, well, then.
But Thursday's fine because Thursday is
Thanks a million.
classes, yeah.
Jennifer, do you already know Jackie Murray?
We've had communication, I think, for sure.
I think we've exchanged emails, but
Yeah.
I don't think we've actually had the chance to meet in person. So it's nice to meet you over over Zoom at least.
Yeah, exactly.
So.
Let me see, Meg, do you have the power to make Jennifer's video come through? Because I could not turn on my video. So I think that there you go.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
All right.
You have all the power, Meg. We have an estimate of how yes, I told us it's a colleague who's bringing his seminar, and then he has planned the second part. I would say about an hour. Would that be?
Yeah. I can skip over things if need be. I can move it along or stretch it out. There's a lot going on. There's a lot I can say.
But we also don't want to over exploit you. So I'm delighted to have you, and I will just be very brief at the beginning to welcome everybody and to thank the people who have helped us organizing this. Just do the housekeeping.
Right.
Let's say.
That sounds good.
So we will do that.
I'm trying to see which the best way to deal with this.
So we were reading We Refugees in class today, Jackie. Cool. Yes, and so I was mentioning the visa panic because I think that several in the class are international students. Yeah. I am an international faculty member, and
so so
I totally hear you. I know
this is like no, yeah. My colleague Valerio and I, because Valerio is Italian as well, and we're both applying for a green card and whatever at the same time, and yeah, like
it's a thing. It's a thing.
It's a thing. It's a whole thing.
It is, especially today. It's a big thing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and if you, at least here at UK, they actually have a really good immigration office, at least when we were going through, and they were really on top of things. But by then I was so used to people not knowing what they're doing, and it's just like, it was like a breath of fresh air to find somebody who's like, oh, you need to do this. Yeah. Let's do this here, strategically do that. Like, wow.
That is,
yeah.
It is a lot. So.
Oh yeah.
Let me see from Meg if I need to do something or if she is going to be in charge. I'll be right back, and then we will. Meg, I only see.
What are you working on, Jennifer?
Sorry?
What are you working on? Like, what are you teaching something this semester? What are you
so I'm teaching, I've got my History 101 class, sort of the bread and butter, and and I'm doing Intro to the Ancient Near East.
Oh, nice.
So
nice.
That's been really fun so far. I've got a great group of students.
Oh,
so.
Yeah, that would be so good. Yeah, that would be a great course if we could offer.
What are you teaching?
Oh, I'm teaching 4 courses. One of them, because we don't have enough people, and we have to run the Greek program, and so 3 of them are Greek, and one is the Anna Julia Cooper course, so Black Classicisms. But but it's like the Iliad is one course for the undergrads. Then the graduate course is Jewish writers in Greek, or basically Hellenistic prose, focusing heavily on Jewish writers in Greek, but with some others. And then the other course is an accelerated Greek called Zero to Homeric Hero. So hopefully by midterm, I will get those guys into the other class. So that's only then 3 courses.
Oh, cool. That's awesome.
Yeah. So far, we're going pretty well. They're actually doing all their memorizing of forms, so
Nice.
it can happen. And they've seen that they're almost there, because I'm using Far's first Homeric Greek text, which actually is really cool because it gives you the vocabulary based on as you're reading through the beginning feeling. So look, you can recognize these words. So we're getting there.
Nice.
So yeah.
Okay.
But,
I think
that's
we
our
have
goal.
about 50 people in the room. So I think I will start so that we can get started with the lecture. So welcome everybody to the Global Humanities lecture. It is a great joy to welcome you here today. My name is Simona Bertacco, and I am the Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Comparative Humanities. And I just want to take a couple of minutes to just say a few words about the event and thank all of the people who helped us make it possible. Before I pass the screen and the microphone to my colleague, Jennifer Westerfeld, who is Associate Professor in the Department of History and one of our greatest collaborators, who will introduce our esteemed speaker today. So this is a really special occasion for the humanities and for the Global Humanities Lecture, because it celebrates its 10th anniversary. The Global Humanities Lecture was launched in fall of 2011 as an annual initiative of our PhD program and of our graduate programs, I would say, in the humanities, to build critical awareness of why it is not just important, but really vital to put diversity and a global approach at the center of our model of a humanities education. The fact that we are celebrating its 10th birthday is a strong testimony, not only of the importance of the issues that scholars and artists like Jackie Murray today have brought to our university and to our lecture, but also of the important support that it has received from the students and the colleagues at our university and in our college. And for this, I am extremely grateful. But this is a special edition of the Global Humanities Lecture for another important reason that has to do with its date and its place. This is the week in which we reflect on the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., while the debate on the space for critical race theory in public education is raging. As for the location, unfortunately, we had to shift the meeting to the Zoom platform, but the substance, in my view, remains. This year we start from here, from Louisville and Kentucky. Louisville, because our city has been at the center of the world's attention for the past 2 years for its important role in the racial and social justice struggle. And because the humanities in this post-academic, post-pandemic moment are dangerously under attack in academia. It seems therefore important to show to our community the incredible work that scholars and activists in the humanities here in Kentucky are doing. And this leads me to our speaker today. I am truly grateful that Professor Jackie Murray from the University of Kentucky has accepted our invitation. In her research, but also in her teaching, Jackie Murray blends the study of antiquity and the classics with a focus on race studies and racial formation. We're honored to welcome such an innovative and interdisciplinary speaker and thinker at U of L. I'm going to conclude with a few but heartfelt words of thanks for our amazing sponsors and collaborators. I'd like to start by thanking Meg Kennedy, Administrative Associate in Comparative Humanities, for overseeing every single aspect of this today. We would not be here without you, Meg. And I would like to thank our sponsors for their unwavering support to this initiative. The Commission on Diversity and Racial Equity, Mary P. Sheridan, Director of the Commonwealth Center for the Humanities and Society, Regina Roebuck, Chair of Classical and Modern Languages Department, Pamela Beatty, Chair of the Department of Comparative Humanities, Brenda McCormack, Director of the Anne Braden Institute for Social Justice Research, and Jennifer Westerfeld, President of the Kentucky chapter of the Archaeological Institute of America. Finally, a sincere thank you to all the many colleagues in my department, as well as in the other departments who are here this afternoon and who have helped me promote this event among their students and their friends. You are too many to list, but thank you to each one of you. I'm now turning over the screen to Professor Westerfeld, who will introduce our speaker this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you, Simona. Our Global Humanities lecturer for 2022, Dr. Jackie Murray, is an associate professor in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages, Literatures, and Culture at the University of Kentucky. She is a classicist and a specialist in the Greek and Latin poetry of the Hellenistic era. But to define her work solely in those terms would be to diminish its true scope and breadth, which extends from the Mediterranean world of the poets Apollonius and Callimachus to that of the contemporary African-American and Afro-Caribbean authors whose writing reinvents and reimagines the classical tradition. Her analysis of epic poems like the Argonautica offers new ways of seeing these ancient texts, considering them with an eye towards better understanding the dynamics of race, gender, and alterity as these operated in the ancient world. And it's aspects of this research that we're going to be hearing more about in her lecture this afternoon. Professor Murray's work on Hellenistic poetry, as rich and nuanced as it is, represents only one facet of her overall research program, however. Much of her recent research and teaching has come to center not only on the ancient sources themselves, but on the modern intersections of race, racism, and the classics. Among other things, she has explored the role of the classics in Black intellectual history, notably in relation to the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, the subject of a major conference that she recently organized, and the appearance of monsters from classical literature in contemporary African-American and Afro-Caribbean literature, which is the topic of a forthcoming book chapter that sounds just absolutely fascinating and amazing. Through this work, Professor Murray has become a powerful advocate for decolonizing the study of the ancient Mediterranean world and exposing and dismantling the structures of white supremacy that have long excluded scholars of color from full participation in the academy. In her research and her advocacy, she embodies two of the core ideals of the Department of Comparative Humanities here at the University of Louisville: the global reach of the humanities and of humanistic scholarship, and the importance of the humanities as fundamentally a public-facing discipline. So for all of these reasons, we are so very fortunate indeed to welcome her as our 10th anniversary Global Humanities Lecturer. So thank you so much, Professor Murray, for joining us today, and I will turn things over to you.
Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for inviting me. It's really a great honor to be the speaker, but also to be on this anniversary. It's really, I don't know, choking me up. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if this works. We tried it before. It did work once upon a time. Here we go. Okay. So as both the introducers pointed out, my work tries to bridge the gap between the ancient world and ideas of identity and race, etc., and the modern world. And since our experience of race is in the now, in the modern world, when we look back on the ancient world, it's important that we're looking at the right thing. And the tendency has been to try to import our current racial construction into the past. This has been the process even in the 19th century, where there's an assumption that race is based on skin color or phenotypic features, etc. And then want to go back into the ancient world and find or not find people with various features. And it's particularly looking for Black people in antiquity tended to have a modern racial coloration to it. So in this paper, I'm going to be building on the approaches to race and racism that I've sort of outlined in my recent article, Race and the Body, Racecraft and Sexuality in the Odyssey. That's in Denise McCoskey's edited volume, A Cultural History of Race in Antiquity, the first volume. So my approach is to combine the theoretical and philosophical frameworks of philosophers of race, such as Falguni Sheth, Taylor, Theodore Allen, historians, Barbara and Karen Fields, and also looking at anti-colonial philosophy, Fanon, Achille Mbembe's necropolitics, and most recently I've started to apply and think about Kathy Gatcha's work on warfare, populist ravaging, and martial rape, and from a feminist perspective, and bringing that into the question. So in the case of Mbembe's theorization of sovereign power, that is the power of the dominant group to utterly destroy or dehumanize and humiliate the other without consequence, that is one aspect that I draw on. And Gatcha's discussion of populist ravaging warfare, where the point of the warfare is indeed to humiliate and dehumanize women and girls, especially as to have them as part of a deracinated group among the conquerors. So these ideas, I think, combine nicely with things I'm thinking about, looking for how the epics, which tend to deal with war, treat race in antiquity. And it's also important, I think, to get away from the commonplace tendency to talk about race as if it were the same as ethnic identity, or to talk about race as if it boils down to physical features or descent lines. For these are just epiphenomena as far as I can see. It's rather more useful to see racial categories as the products of an initial or originary mass violent act, typically warfare, populist ravaging, as Gatcha refers to it, that destroys pre-existing social or cultural or communal family structures for that group, destroying their bonds with other members of the group of the conquered. And that subjects the conquered to violent dehumanization at that moment, but also maintained through ongoing repetition, reenactments, maintained through cultural, political, legal, and economic processes that either reconstruct or reenact this race-making violence actually or symbolically, and to a greater or lesser degree, and continuously naturalize and justify the hierarchical relationship established by that initiatory violence of, say, colonial conquest or genocide, etc. So I want to then get away from the notion that racial categories always have to be tied to physical features or etc. They don't. And even in our modern American construct of race, the current one that we operate with, physical features, phenotypic features are constantly moving and changing as historical circumstances force the dominant culture, the dominant racial hierarchy to recalibrate itself and the racial boundaries. And so I'm going to give an outline then of the talk. So I'm going to talk first about this trans-historical definition of race, because I think that's probably the most important thing I would want you to take away from this talk is, what am I talking about when I talk about race, and what is racecraft? And then a brief section talking about war as a specific form of race making. And then finally, I'll give some examples from the epics that I've been looking at, the Odyssey, Iliad, Odyssey, I haven't been in the wrong order apparently, Iliad, Odyssey, Argonautica, and the Aeneid, and looking at how these epics are racecraft in the sense that they tell the story in ways that justify, naturalize the hierarchy that is implied by the epics. Okay, so let's begin with this trans-historical definition. So Du Bois famously, of course, observed that the modern construction of race that we operate under is based primarily on skin color. As he says, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, and we could say it's the same, still basically the same today. Now, to illustrate the idea that this kind of construction of race is not actually based in something essential, but it's actually something that's moving, I want to actually start with a story by an Appalachian person. So since we're in the vicinity here of Appalachia, important figure in Appalachian studies is Lillian Smith, and she's more or less younger contemporary of Du Bois, same kind of lifespan. And she talks about her childhood with this experience of the color line. And I want to go give her story that she tells here. So she says, quote, "A little white girl was found in the colored section of our town, living with a Negro family in a broken down shack. Now, this family had moved in a few weeks before, and little was known of them. Now, since the child was, quote, very white indeed, it was generally assumed that the child had been kidnapped. And after harassing the family, who refused to talk about the origins of the child, the white women of the town, escorted by the marshal, took the child from the Negro family despite their tears and protests. Janie, the little white girl, was then brought to Lillian's home, where she shared Lillian's bedroom. And for a while, the two little girls played together and were inseparable and best friends. However, this friendship was not to last, because Lillian writes, quote, "In a little while, my mom called my sister and me into her bedroom and told us that in the morning, Janie would have to return to Color Town." In response to Lillian and her sisters, "Why?" and her mother said, "Because Lillian is a little colored girl." When Lillian protested, "But she's white," her mother retorted, "You're mistaken, she's colored." "But she's colored. Please don't argue." "What does that mean?" Lillian whispered. Her mother says, "It means that she has to live in Colored Town with colored people." So Lillian persisted in the buts and the whys and the I don't understands, but her mother finally shut her down and any further discussion with, quote, "You're too young to understand." Nevertheless, the adults left it to little Lillian to explain to Janie why she had to leave. Lillian records that it was the first time she realized that there was some mighty force out there that compelled everyone to change the way they treated Janie. And despite herself, she felt compelled to believe that they were right. And she said, "It was the only way my world could be held together." And slowly it began to seep through me. I was white, she was colored, and we must not be together. It was bad to be together. Though we eat with our nurse when we are little, it was bad to eat with any colored person after that. It was bad, just as other things were bad with your mother when your mother had told you. It was bad that she was to sleep in the room with me that night. It was bad. So as Lillian then grows older, she has more experiences like this and began to feel that, quote, something is wrong with the world. And that tells you that love is good and people are important, and then forces you to deny love and humiliate people. So Smith ends the chapter with her memory of a Black woman saying to her quietly as they're riding on the bus, "We cannot ride together on the bus. Oh, you know, it's not legal to be human down here." So Janie's story exposes a false belief that it's the awareness of physical difference that causes racism, and that physical differences are necessary criteria of race. Janie was physically white, just as Lillian was. And so even in a racial system as ours, that's supposedly rooted in phenotypic skin color and physical appearance, it turns out that it's just, and it's not real, turns out not to be a real shibboleth. Janie was white one day and colored the next day. Rather, the marker of Janie's race was the fact that the white folks in the town had decided that she had to go back to colored town. So racism was the force out there, as Lillian put it, the ideology that perpetuated the hegemonic power in the society and made it illegal for Janie to be treated as a human. Now, in terms of looking at race in a historical perspective, Theodore Allen points out a really important aspect of race that often gets lost in attempts to look at race as a cultural identity marker, as opposed to what it actually is, which is, as he says, to define the term racial, when it comes to defining the term racial, it concerns the historian only as it relates to a pattern of oppression, subordination, subjugation, exploitation of one set of humans over another. So race is not some identity marker that we can apply to a group objectively, that is, without reference to domination and a dominant group, nor is it an identity marker that a group can take on by itself in absence of some violence-backed hierarchical relationship to other groups. So Black or yellow or red races make no sense if there is not also a white or Caucasian race that is constructing these barriers and hierarchies. So then there's a power structure that needs to be there to defining the boundaries, and that this is beyond our control as individuals or even as group. So it's a very complex web of relations. So Janie can't decide for herself that she is Black or white. It's the white people, the white power structure, not even the individual white people, but the white power structure that does it for her. Okay, so in terms of how I think we should look at race in this idea of a continuum, where it's thinking about in terms of otherness along the continuum, where on one end of the continuum, the dominant group, they have arrogated to themselves hegemonic control over, or hegemonic control over institutions, political, social, etc., military powers, and they have the ability to determine tendentiously the other group's relationship to them vis-a-vis power. And the way in which they relate to the other groups is in relation to what extent they see the other groups as having approximate humanity to them. So they take for themselves an inalienable sense of humanity. Any attempt to diminish that will result in retaliation, violent retaliation, often. Whereas the other groups are in relation to them are subject to alienable humanity, in that they can be treated in ways that are demeaning and humiliating, according to how how it serves the dominant group's interests. And so, like the sword of Damocles, then racialization hangs over ethnic groups as a form of persistent dehumanization that's lurking, waiting to happen, whether it's literal or symbolic, depending on what is going to be in the interest of the larger hierarchical structure. And then Smith points out, she understands race to be a mode of, or a vehicle of division and separation, hierarchy exploitation, rather than as this distinctive marker. And the Field Sisters also argue that in their important book, Racecraft, that the processes that convince us that races are objective, out there, natural categories that operate like witchcraft, to bypass our reasoning and logic, and to resist any attempt at any incontrovertible evidence to the contrary. So they point out that Racecraft, quote, is part of a complex system of beliefs that combined moral and cognitive content that presuppose invisible spiritual realities underlying and continually acting upon the material realms of beings and events. Now, Du Bois sort of anticipated this in The Negro, where he talks about the fact that scholars and historians of his day, classicists in particular, and historians, ancient historians, were unwilling to see Black people in the ancient world, Africans, Negroes in the ancient world. And he points out that, well, in North America, this is at the time he's talking in the Jim Crow era. So in North America, a Negro may be 7/8 white, since the term refers to any person of Negro descent. So this is what it meant to be a Negro back then. And if we use this term, the same sense concerning the inhabitants of the rest of the world, then we may say truthfully that Negroes have been among the leaders of civilization in every age of the world's history, from Babylon to modern America. In sharp contrast, this usage of the term Negro in Africa has been more and more restricted, even until some scientists late in the last century, so 1800s, declared that the great mass of Black and brown people in Africa were not Negroes at all, and that the real Negro dwells in a small space between the Niger and Senegal, i.e. sub-Saharan Africa. So here he's pointing out that this definition of race that he's operating with, that they're operating with, some in his case resistantly operating with, that it's obviously not even being applied consistently. Because if it were being applied consistently through time, then people would be recognizing that, well, Africa, every part of Africa would have quote unquote Negroes in it. However, what he gets at ultimately in the next part of this passage is to say, well, what's really going on is that they're not seeing Negroes there because they don't want to see Negroes there. So it's an ideology that is dictating what the racial boundaries are. So bearing in mind this definition that Du Bois is operating with in that time period, the 20s and 30s, we can look back at the racecraft at that time. And here I'm just going to zero in on the tragic mulatto films of the era, where the idea is that of passing, that is that a Black, defined as Du Bois is referring to it, person is passing as white, right? And in these films, the the passer is always played by an actual, or is actual in the sense that everybody recognizes actual, white actress. Someone who in the real world is white or accepted as white, is then playing a white passing Black person. And then in the 50s, the same story continues, right? So so the whole Jim Crow era, right up to the moment of the civil rights movement, you get these stories sort of making the idea of being of mixed ancestry problematized, but also questioning this whole issue of phenotypic features, but always putting in contrast the white passing or white actress as the white passing Black person in contrast to her mother, who is often canonically the Negro. So in the previous one, the mother is the model for Aunt Jemima, right? And here, they got Aunt Jemima out of it, but the idea is that she's got much more quote unquote Negro features. Now, what's interesting is how we're still in this color phenotypic features race definition today. And like 5, 10, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, we still can't get out of the idea that a white passing Black woman or Black passing white woman can't exist, right? And so we can think about the whole controversy of Rachel Dolezal, where she was claiming Black identity, right? Again, this gets to the point where I'm saying that the individual can't, even if they actually have phenotypic features, they cannot in our system actually cross the boundaries of their race. And then most recently, in terms of this idea of the racecraft continuing to make us continue to think about phenotypic features as racial definers in our context, most recently we have on Netflix, it's on now, is Passing, which is supposedly based on Nella Larson's Passing. I don't think so. It's not as close as they would like us to believe. But if you notice that the women that are playing the characters, particularly the blonde on the right, would not pass. I would bet. I could ask my mother. in that time period, in the 50s, 40s, she would not be able to pass. Because the ideal passer actually looks like the characters of the 59 movies. So, but we have in our context, we demand that the Blackness be visible even in the passer if they're passing. So I wanted to bring that in to just to show you how even within a system where everyone seems to be somehow okay with or accepting of the idea that race is based on physical features, based on ancestry, based on skin color, within 100 years, that same categorization system is constantly being recalibrated according to the social constructions and the social historical conditions of the day. And so back to Du Bois, right? The Black man is defined by the fact that he's the person who must ride Jim Crow in Georgia, right? It's the social constructions that are defining race. Sorry. So yet around the same time that Du Bois is making this statement, right? Lillian Smith's Janie, based on what she looks like, was white. It was because she appeared racially white to the white women at one moment, and then they discovered that she had non-existent Black blood, and then she was no longer white, but now she is colored. So Janie's story, I think, exposes this false belief that it is the awareness of physical features, that physical features are inherent or essential to categories of race. you can have race and racism among people who typically look very similar. So that sort of gets me out of that sort of deviation into the relationship between race and physical features. Because the reason why I'm making this statement is because in antiquity, physical features were not as salient or even important for the racial categorization, right? Mainly because they had it in their minds and in their theories that it's not a good idea to have the group of exploited people be of the same ethnicity or any kind of similarity, because then they could use that similarity as a means for solidarity and then resistance. And so a lot of the advice or theories is actually against trying to group people according to how they would look, or even from the same place. You try to minimize the amount of people from the same place. All right, so then if we look at racism then as race as something that is connected to racism, that it is the motive to oppress and exploit, conquer, exterminate is the first ontologically prior moment. And then racism is the ideology that justifies why things are the way they are and how they should stay that way in terms of the oppressive hierarchy. And then there are the ways in which race comes into being, like how do you create these categories now? Well, violence, I'm saying, is the first. There's some originary violence, war that deracinates the people from their society. And then downstream consequences, they are in the conqueror society, where then institutions, legal mechanisms, education maintain and reinforce that originary creation of the subgroup. And then there's also these soft power mechanisms of reinforcing that, which is what I'm calling racecraft, the storytelling, the monuments, the art, etc. And so Du Bois, again, points out that a crucial aspect of race creation, which I think is we can export into the ancient world, is dehumanization, monstrification, and when we're dealing with the storytelling and art parts of the soft mechanisms of racecraft. So he says, one cannot ignore the extraordinary fact that there's a world campaign beginning with the slave trade and ending with the refusal to capitalize the word quote unquote Negro, leading through a passionate defense of slavery by attributing every bestiality to Blacks, and finally culminating in the evident modern profit that lies in degrading Blacks. All this has unconsciously trained millions of honest modern men into the belief that Black folk are subhuman, a mass of despicable men, inhuman, and at best laughable, at worst the meat of mobs and fury. And remember, he's writing this during the nadir of race relations with the lynchings, etc., reinforcing again. So lynchings again is another violent mode of reinforcing racial hierarchy. And so we can look at through the ages then, going from the 15th century forward, the monstrification of Black skin is evident in artwork, all over the world, all over the colonializing world, the imperial nations, to reinforce this idea of, or establish this idea of that the Black race is worthy of slavery, exploitation, etc. They are monsters, they are subhuman, etc. And these images continue on in films and all throughout. And we even continue to see them today. So even the brutality that goes with the killing of Trayvon Martin, etc., and George Floyd, all these images of brutality are all part and parcel of the reinforcing, reenacting that originary violent act that created the Black race. And so to get back to the Fields sisters' racecraft, they give an example. Well, the peasants didn't fall under the dominion of the nobility by virtue of being perceived as inferior, innately inferior, right? No, it was the act of, they came to be perceived innately inferior by the fact that they fell under the authority of the nobility's dominion. They were conquered, and that is how they then became inferior. Okay, so then if we think about it, then races are not given in nature. Racecraft makes us think it is. So now let's think about war as a race-making process, one of the mechanisms of creating race from nothing, right? So I argue then that epic poetry is going to be, as a text, especially the poetry that is about war, it's going to be transmitting into the receiving society, ancient or modern, a mythical social order that placed the heroes, the conquerors, the demigods at the top of the human hierarchy, and non-heroes, especially the people who are the oppressed, the exploited, the ones who are exploited by the heroes, at the bottom. Moreover, since the epic can only really exist alongside non-heroes, the epic hero can only exist alongside non-heroes who can be dehumanized and who can be exploited by him, then this mythical order is a racial order, right? The heroes have the ability and have to have the ability to dehumanize. And this is where Gatcha's work comes in as well, because the whole idea of populace ravaging, which the epic stories tend to be about, the Iliad especially is about the destruction, the genocide of the Trojans. That act is going to be creating a racial order in the survivors, and the survivors are young women and marriageable age women and girls. Those are the survivors. Everybody else is destroyed. So to expose the power dynamic between heroes and oppressed and exploited peoples of the mythical world, then I'm going to take up this critical oppositional strategy, right? And so from this vantage point, we get a better view of the heroes as a superior race of mortals in the mythical world. And they arrogate to themselves the power and the right to decide who can live and who can die, right? And they're the closest beings to the gods, and the heroes determine who among their inferiors or the other groups, be they women and other non-heroes, who are going to be the ones to take risk for their lives, whose women and children can be enslaved, trafficked, brutalized, and whose civilization and culture can be wiped out. So this is what we can say that is happening in the mythical world. And Membe points out then that the ultimate expression of sovereignty, which I'm claiming for the heroes, that they have sovereignty, resides in a large degree in the power and their capacity to dictate who is going to live and who must die. Hence, to kill and to allow to live constitutes the limits of sovereignty, its fundamental attributes. So to exercise sovereignty is to exercise total control over the mortality, define the life and the deployment and manifestation of power. Okay, so that being the case, the whole act of war then is the way in which you exert your sovereignty. So to get to the colonial, the appropriation of colonial theory into my thinking is that in colonies, the sovereign might kill at any time and in any manner. Colonial warfare is not legal or it's not subject to legal and constitutional rules. In other words, there is none that can contain it. And it is legally codified, it's not a legally codified activity. Colonial wars are conceived of as expressions of an absolute hostility that sets the conqueror against an absolute enemy. So that concept of total war is the originary action. So what I'm saying is then that in a story where the war wipes out the conqueror, then this is the originary action of that racial hierarchy that is being established. And it's through the humiliation and dehumanization of the characters. All right, so let's move now to the epics. So I have my own like sort of shorthand for how we can tell that race is probably operating here. And the shorthand works like this. If there's monsterification or dehumanization happening in the story, and there are double standards between the hero and that other character, or there's violence that is humiliating, then we're probably dealing with race. Okay, so let's start off with the Iliad. And I was just teaching the Iliad right before this class. So we have maiden aidetea Peliadeu Achilleos ulomenein heimuria kaios algeateke polas diftimusukas aidi preapsen heron autus de eloria tuke kunesin oinoisi tapasi dios de teleto bule. So I want to start here with wrath. He's asking, the poet is asking the goddess to sing of the wrath of Peleus' son Achilles, and that this wrath is ulomene. Now, what's interesting is the image that we get at the very beginning of the poem is of bodies lying on the battlefield and being humiliated and dehumanized by vultures and dogs, right? So this is, we know from other stories in the Greek epic, Greek mythical universe, that the gods despise this kind of scene. Right? You can think of Antigone, where the gods are abhorrent of the body, the heroic body lying out on the battlefield and being subject to decomposition, but also like ravages by animals. This is the worst way one can die in war, right? As far as a warrior is concerned, to die without receiving burial. And in this story, of course, the issue ultimately becomes, will Achilles allow the enemy that he has killed to be buried, right? This is the issue. And so I would argue that that whole context is the question of whether or not Achilles is going to participate in the racializing construction of the Trojans, the Trojan women and girls, which were the ones who will survive the story, whether he's going to participate in that through this action of dehumanization of Hector, who is their protector. Oh, sorry, let's move here. All right. Then we think about Chryses, who is the priest who comes to get his daughter, right? His daughter is being held as the prize for Agamemnon. Chryses, the father, comes to rescue her and ransom her. He's brought countless gifts to get her back. And Agamemnon's response is, I don't have to do that. In fact, he then humiliates him because, again, Chryses has been defeated, humiliates him, saying that not only am I not going to give her back, but she's going to be my slave. She's going to work in my looms and she's going to sleep in my beds. So this is a horrifying image for the father to be faced with, especially since he can't seem to protect her even with money. But he has a backer. So this cannot be done. So Homer presents this as this is something that cannot actually be done because Chryses has a backer, which is the god Apollo. And so even though he is, Agamemnon is engaging in sovereign power, right? He's forgetting that above him is the god and that the god will not allow this to be with impunity, right? Now, contrast that with Thersites, the regular warrior, one might say. He's not a hero, but he's part of the Achaean host. And he makes the exact same complaint about Agamemnon's overreaching authority that Achilles makes. However, he does not meet with the same respect. In fact, he is described by Homer in monstrifying terms, I would say. He's ugly, he's bandy-legged, he's he's described as the most hideous of the heroes. And then he is then treated to abuse, physical abuse, in front of everybody, to humiliate him by Achilles, to keep him in his place. And so here you have the idea that some warriors among the group that are not heroes, right? And that they are being, basically they're just fodder for the war, and that they should just follow orders and not worry about have any say in anything. Yeah, so now then we can think about also the meeting between Andromache and Hector, where this shows that her fate is tied up with his fate, and that she reminds her husband that, well, Achilles, he will be reasonable, right? Because when he conquered my city, right, he was reasonable. He gave my father honor. So he didn't humiliate the body of my father when he conquered my city. So there's an expectation that as a hero, Achilles is supposed to behave according to a code that recognizes the humanity to a certain extent of Hector or of the Trojans, and not actually engage in the kind of dehumanizing violence that we actually see going on in the rest of the story. So that is an expectation we would expect. But as we know, of course, when we get to the end of the story, his rage has gotten to such an extent that he is not. And so here you have you have Hector speaking to him, trying to reason with him, knowing what his wife had said about how, okay, well, now that we've come to this moment where we are going to kill each other, here, how about you and I make a deal and we treat each other with respect. And that Achilles, of course, says no. And he actually says, we're different species, right? He says, what does a lion and the lamb have anything to do with each other? So he's totally not going to happen. And so the gods have to intervene at that moment to get him to give the body back. So he too has forgotten that above him there is a power source. So I think I'm over time, or are we? Because I can quickly go through the Odyssey if I'm not over, but I'm looking at my thing. It says,
well,
we can have conversation in the
yeah.
We can leave it for the Q&A. So I would say that the same kind of thing is operating in the Odyssey as well, and also in the Argonautica, in terms of how we can look at how are the people that are not heroes being treated, and how they are, especially in death, or how are they being compared to monsters such as the Cyclopses or Typhoeus, etc. And then also how that maps onto how they're being treated. And so, yes, I'm happy to talk about that. In fact, the Odyssey part I've already actually argued in an article, so you can even have detailed version of that. But I'm happy to take questions. I think it would be good to start a conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this wide-ranging talk, for reading to us in Greek. It was wonderful. Now, I would like to just say how we're going to do the Q&A. So there is a Q&A function, and if people just type their questions there, it would be easier for us to follow the correct order we can read them, or we can ask the speakers to read them aloud, okay? So I would open the floor to any questions or comments that you would like to ask our speaker.
Something in the chat.
Let me see if, well, there was a lot to take in. So
Yeah.
I know that we all need a little bit of time to think and come up with something also interesting.
Oh, yeah. So we've got a question by Bo here.
Yes.
Yeah, how is race determined between two heroes of the same text? So yeah, of the same text. Well, in the same text, you mean? So like in the Iliad. Well, this is precisely what I kind of want to get at, is that they're trying to have a war, this war of extermination, basically, right? And somehow avoid the heroes like Hector and from being racialized, right, by the dehumanization that's going to take place, right? Because so we're allowing the heroes to have a proper death burial somehow, and but their women and girls are going to be enslaved and taken and brutally treated. So there is a contradiction going on in what Homer is presenting. There's the reality, which there would be no worrying about proper burial for the actual combatant warrior in the real world, right? But Homer is concerned about the morality, I would say, of the whole warrior code, right? And is concerned about that. And so the text is actually is not pro-war, one might say. It's actually trying to put some kind of restraints on war, so that you don't end up with this. So I would say that in the Iliad, what's happening is this attempt by Achilles to racialize Hector, which is rejected by the whole narrative, that you can't do that. It says, there's another one. Ann Hall says, I just wanted to thank you. Okay, I thought you had a question.
There is a question in the chat from Elaine Weiss. What do you make of Odysseus' size and stature as evidence of racial difference?
So, as I said, I don't think that physical features have anything to do in the ancient world to do with race in the sense there. Now, so he is black, as far as I would translate Melanchrois as black, but so are other characters. Memnon is black, so he's a hero. Heroes can be black, right? So blackness in the epics and in antiquity is more to do with ethnicity, I would say, than race, because he's not subordinated in this way. Now, the Cyclops, however, his size and one eye and how his physical features are, these are monstrified features that aren't real, right? But these are attributed by metaphor or by the exaggeration of the story. These are attributed to shepherds, right? And so they have this imaginary essence of the Cyclops because they're the subordinated group, right? And so Odysseus has transferred to the Cyclops, to the hero, to his own shepherds, this monstrified shepherd. And so it's not a real, he doesn't have to have any real actual status or stature. That's different. It's the imagined, sort of like the blood, having the different blood as a racialized, it's an imaginary thing. So let's see, we've got some more in the question. I understand correctly, this is Derek Henman. You want to think of race not in terms of any sort of physical, but rather as an avenue of oppression, yes, etc. that could, yes, that's how I understand it. So yes, I see race as related to racism, or oppression. It's similar to class, very close to class, in fact. It was appealing to some kind of metaphysical essence that justifies the difference. Let's see, then you have, I can't see, so Catherine says, I have many questions running through my head, but my main one relates to whether you have observed differences in this power racial dynamic between male and female. Oh, absolutely. Yes, definitely. Yeah, this is where Kathy Gackus' work comes in, because she talks about how the capturing and raping and enslaving of women was actually the focus of the this kind of populist ravaging war, right? And so once you've taken these women, girls, and they usually are nubile women and girls, older women, middle-aged women, they're usually humiliated and killed. But the younger women, you're going to then have them sold into slavery, operate in prostitution. They're going to be part of the household, as we see in Odysseus. They're part of the household. So they have no more any social connection. Like they don't have any family, any society that they can even appeal to. No protector. So they are, then that's how they are racialized. It's much, they are actually the beginnings of that race, is what I'm saying. It's like, so after the war has wiped out all the men, all the older people, etc., it's just these young women and girls, and maybe babies, if they allow the babies to live, they are what then becomes the race, right? Because they then become the mother of the enslaved children, etc., right? So that's what I'm getting at. So yeah, women are absolutely crucial for this this particular thing I'm working on. So Nancy says, big question, but could you discuss the role of race in Greek comedies? Oh, I can't, sorry. Other than the Cyclops, I can't, because I'm not an expert on Greek comedy, but I could talk about the Cyclops, Euripides Cyclops, because I've written about that one, where he retells the basic Cyclops story in the Odyssey, but with a comedic, through a comedic lens, and you have throw in some satyrs and you're good to go. But there you can see that the Cyclops is no longer the shepherd. Instead, he's a hunter. So he's moved into the heroic category there, because he and Odysseus are going to be, Odysseus is going to treat him as if he's a hero and try to negotiate with him on talking about how we have the same gods, etc., etc. Meanwhile, the satyrs, who are the shepherds, they are clearly being dehumanized in that. So that's the only one I can talk about in terms of comedy. But there the comedy is, I think it's connected to the Syracusan attempt to wipe out the Athenians, or the killing of the Athenians in the Syracuse quarry pits. But I think it's got to do with there you can see that the Cyclops is standing in, and the shepherds are standing together as a racial discourse, I think. And let's see, we've got Marianne, or is there something in the chat? I can't see. I teach Hebrew. This is Natalie. Natalie Pulser. Pulser. So yeah, when I teach Hebrew Bible, some students have trouble believing me when I say that contemporary categories of race based on physical features are irrelevant. Ethnicity and descent establish status. So can you suggest a way to deal with this sensitively in class? Yeah, so that's trying to get around that that problem. Yeah, is hard. Yeah, well, that's why I tell them the story that I told about Lillian Smith, or you could talk about the yeah, I guess you'd have to talk about the difference between our version of race and their version, and how, yeah, there were, well, in the Bible, I'm not as familiar with all the characters in terms of their physical features, right? Because I don't recall them being given many physical features, but the problem with the Bible, I think even more so than classics, is the fact that the biblical texts were heavily used for racialization, right? Like the whole idea of the race of Ham and all of this stuff comes out of the Bible. So it's kind of hard to deal with that. Yeah, I'm sorry I can't be more helpful on that. But do you have a follow-up on that, Natalie? Are you still in the chat? Let's see. Okay, let's see. Let me see if I can see any more questions. Let's see.
So there are a couple here in the Q&A. One asks you about the views of race of Greek philosophers. And then Pamela Beatty asks, so what might be some cultural characteristics that are brought into play in the classical racecraft? So I'm thinking of the Cyclops inversion of the ideal of hospitality, for example.
Yeah.
I remember that similar issues are present in the Argonautica, but I'm not as familiar with that text.
Right. Yeah. So in terms of the philosophers, there you can see with, say, both Plato and Aristotle engage in a kind of racecraft. Certainly Aristotle actually is engaged in racecraft in trying to establish a natural slave. Yeah, so there's definitely I'm working on, with my next door neighbor who's a philosopher, we're working on going through systematically Plato. So I only have some like vague thoughts right now in relation to the way in which he compares. What's striking to me is that he compares being enslaved to running away from slavery as somehow a bad thing, because it's like suicide is like running away from a good master. So the whole issue of how slavery sort of embedded in the thinking needs to be explored. Yeah. So my colleague and next door neighbor David Kaufman and I are reading through all of Plato to try to understand that, because you want to work on that. In terms of the cultural characteristics, so in terms of the Odyssey, for sure, you can see the cultural characteristics, especially the way that the Cyclops Island is described, and it's being described in a way to, in part, to remind the Phaeacians of where they used to live and stuff like that, but also in terms of antithetical to Greek culture, right, as you point out. Now, in case of the Argonautica, there you have a similar situation. So the very clear case of racializations that happen in the Argonautica are in books 1 and book 2, where the first one in Cyzicus, where the Argonauts wipe out the people that live on one half of the island of Cyzicus. And the way they treat those people, they're monstrified. They're like trees, and they've got multiple arms, and they're even said to be monsters sent by Hera for Heracles. And they live in the mountains, and they're wild, and they're very cyclopean. In a lot of echoes of the Cyclops episode is in that scene. And then the other one is, and it's explicitly contrasted with the way the Argonauts deal with Cyzicus himself. He's a hero. He's has hospitality. They even have a funeral games for him, etc. And the other one is Amycus, the shepherd king, crucial. And he too is he's a shepherd it's emphasized he's out there checking his sheep, etc. He's wild again. He has this weird immigration policy of like boxing everybody that lands on his territory. So yeah, again, he's like antithetical to their system. So yeah, there are definitely cultural elements that work in the Argonautica and the Odyssey for that. And then we have Robert Eric Shoemaker. He says, thanks. I'm curious about the conscience, so to speak, of the epics you're analyzing. Achilles, the hero, the protagonist, but is raging and terrifying. And as I read it, maybe not meant to be celebrated, right? But questioned. What do you think the intended effect of the racecraft in Homer or others might be, supposing that Achilles might not be in Homer's or in Greek eyes acting appropriately? Is this question something? Yes, the whole idea of like, what is Homer actually doing here? Is he celebrating this behavior? I think he's not. I think he's not celebrating this behavior. I think he's calling it into question. And so it would appear that some people, like say Thersites and women, can be treated in this dehumanizing way, but what Achilles does to Hector is beyond the pale. But then there's a sense that what Achilles was before this text is probably the ideal for Homer, not what he is in the text. Because in the text, he's this raging maniac who just keeps getting angrier and angrier and angrier, and to the point where he's almost like a Tydeus who eats the liver of his or heart of the guy he kills. So he's almost there, like a raging animal. But the stories we hear about him from, say, Andromache or even Briseis or whatever, the stories we hear about him before he's in the Iliad show a different kind of hero. And there's this whole issue of him having this epithet, the gentle Achilles, which always struck me as bizarre. But if he was, he's the one who takes captives, etc., or male captives. So I think there's definitely anti-war sentiment in Homer, and I think he is actually presenting Achilles as behavior is inappropriate, but that within that certain actions are appropriate, but his actions before the text were the ideal, is what I would suggest. That's what I'm working on anyway. I have to fill out the argument. Now, Elaine Weiss has her hand up. According to do you want to say something, Elaine? Or can she, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Oh, am I unmuted? I was just going to say,
we can hear you.
Thank you so much for changing our focus to the way in which race actually destroys previous identity. I think that it's not always tied to physical characteristics, et cetera, because as I was asking the question about Odysseus, I've always been interested in the fact that he is actually not well respected by most of his peers. Mm-hmm. And it's sometimes reflected in the fact that he's small of stature, that he doesn't use the right kind of weapons, et cetera, et cetera. But what I really like is to refocus my thinking on Odysseus in terms of the way in which his identity is slippery. And right. So I thank you for that.
Yeah. And indeed, this guy, like, he comes from a no identity, right? Like, he's in disguise. Mm-hmm. And in the stories he's telling, he's always sort of like anonymous, right? Till they, exactly. Right? Thank and so you. Then he goes into it, getting an identity. Yeah. Thank you for the question. And then we have Kate Kleinikoff says, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the depiction of monstrous women. Yes, I mostly seen this as an issue of sexism, but would you argue that there is, racialization? Yes, I do. There's actually a wonderful book, Scylla by Sarah Hoffman, I think it is. I have it book somewhere right here. But yeah, where she talks about the monster Scylla, and indeed how it's something akin to racism and sexism combined. So we might say intersectionality, right? And yeah, I do think that certainly women are monstrified in the Odyssey, absolutely. All these monstrific women in the Odyssey. If I can make the claim that the shepherds are monstrified by the monstrified Cyclops, then I have to make the same claim that women are monstrified and therefore racialized by many monstrified women in the Odyssey by association. But also I do think that already in the Greek epic mind, going back to Hesiod, that the woman is the model of the racialized gendered other, right? Because in terms of here we actually can point to something physical as well as existing in nature. She has a different body than the male body, right? And that is enough to define subjugation, right? And so we see this in Hesiod, where the monster, a lot of the female figures, their sexuality is constantly trying to be controlled by the male gods. So yeah, I do think that the gender racialization goes together, and and it's not. I don't think it's an accident that that it is the women and the girls that are going to be the ones that are the sort of race that come forward, right? Like they survive the wiping out of the city, and then it's their enslaved children that perpetuate this now enslaved group, right? So I definitely think gender is absolutely is part of it. Absolutely. Yeah. So then we have some other
one more question, and then there is one comment, and with that we will wrap things. You must be a little tired.
I really enjoy this this format. So which question you want to pick the several questions here?
Do you want me to read it? So thank you very much for your talk. I'm stuck in a library nook, so I can't focalize my question. You mentioned the struggle of teaching and studying the classics through the lenses of Racecraft, which carefully understands historical racial constructions without projecting our modern ideas of race and racism backwards. I'm curious if you see Afro-Caribbean authors who deploy tropes taken from the epics or European literature, coded white, as a creative strategy, also reveals the cultural ruptures of racecraft at work? Or are these works, such as The Fisher King, also trapped by the physicality of race that you are working and writing against?
Yeah, so there is this problem, I think, to a certain extent, where Afro-Caribbean writers to a lot of extent tend to have a kind of what I call a racial metaphysic, right? Whereby all Black people, modern and ancient, are the same, are part of the same group, right? And I personally have issues with that, but that is something that is very prevalent in Afro-Caribbean writers for sure. It's challenged a little bit by some African-American writers. And I'm thinking of Charles Johnson. I'm writing something on Charles Johnson's Middle Passage, which is an Odyssey. And there the character is a classicist. Like obviously the character, the narrative, so it's a first person narrative, but it's supposedly a Black man named Calhoun, who is taking over the ship's logs. Then it's a ship that's taking slaves back and forth. And he tells a story, and he has a split personality. Like on the one hand, when he's narrating the story, he narrates as if he's well-educated, classically trained person. But then within the story, when he's depicting himself as a character, he uses all of the racist tropes for Black people that go with him. So there's a tension between his narrating voice and the way he depicts himself in the text. And I think that actually is trying to get at this issue, with Johnson is trying to get at it. So yeah, so it depends. I think a lot, but the problem is I think a lot of Afro-Caribbean writers are enamored with this idea of racial metaphysics, right? Of that all Black people are the same people. And not all, but I definitely think a lot are. And I think that needs to be problematized because there's definitely differences, cultural differences, etc. So yeah, thanks for that question.
Wonderful. And then I think we can finish with several people in the chat have asked for links to your works and they want to read more from you. And I would like to end. And first of all, thanking you, but I'm really borrowing here the words of Britt Thompson. She said, not a question, just gratitude. It's in the chat. This was a fantastic talk, Dr. Murray. I'm a PhD student here, studying the Global South and plantation modernity. I spent a lot of my MA work on the monstrous and was absolutely engrossed in everything you talked about and wished I had known of your work well before now. Thanks so much for being the 10th year anniversary GL Global Humanities lecture speaker. I hope you stay healthy and safe.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I think we should all really thank Professor Murray for such a generous talk and a generative, really Q&A session. And we are really very, very, very grateful. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. And maybe next time we do it in person.
We
It's just up the street.
That's a promise. That is a promise.
Yeah. This will be so great. Yeah.
I have one more question. Several, I think students have asked, we have recorded the session. If you would be okay without sharing the.
Oh yeah, I would like a copy as well. So yeah, absolutely.
You would like the video. Perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, definitely share it. It would be great. And yeah, there's a question about where to find, so I have an academia.edu page. So in that I've uploaded most of my articles there. And then also on my, you go on my UK page, there's a link to my, my drive where I have some of the lectures that I've given. So yeah, if you were looking for more stuff, that would be the place to go.
Wonderful. Jackie, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. This was really an honor.
It was our honor to have you here. So next time, in person.
Yes, absolutely.
I promise.
All right.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for attending. This has
thank you so much. Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.